Hi, everyone. I am William Perry Esping, and I'm going to be talking today about my political ideology as social libertarianism. So, basically, it is, to some extent, you could consider it a moderate or centrist ideology, though I would argue it's not totally accurate to describe it as such because it does have radical elements to it. To some extent, people might say it's too far. In some ways, people might say, oh, it's maybe a bit right-wing. Others might say it's way too left-wing. But in my opinion, it is a great blend of, I think, a lot of the things that we consider to be sort of left or right. And generally, social libertarianism is generally more definitely further left on the political spectrum, and it definitely more or less aligns up with sort of a Bernie Sanders style democracy, though it goes in some ways much further than Bernie Sanders. In other ways, it might be a little bit less extreme than Bernie Sanders. But I'm getting a notification. But it's all about the minutiae and the details of where social libertarianism stands on the political axes. So what I see, so the basic tenets, the basic philosophy underlying social libertarianism is checks and balances of powerful institutions. Basically, it is a very constitutional conservative ideology, because if you look at the basic ideas that the founders of the American Constitution put in to our Constitution, it was to have enough power so the rights of individuals could be protected, but enough liberty that we weren't ruled by a king and we weren't a tyrannical authoritarian nation. And that is the way I would view a decent percentage of at least the goals. The individual founders, I don't think they did not live up to that general purpose and belief structure fully, and they were also things that they didn't personally encounter that, I think they could, at that time that they made the Constitution, and when they were really making a bunch of these amendments that, they never really considered to be necessary to be put into the Constitution. And so to a great extent, social libertarianism seeks to correct those mistakes and to greatly improve the Constitution to be a better force for liberty and freedom and democracy, but limited. Great, but still considering where we are now, we're greatly more improved democracy, but still limited to still protect the rights of individuals. And yeah, so now I'm gonna shift gears to talking more about some of the direct philosophy of what those checks and balances should entail. Generally, the main powerful institutions in a society are the economic elite and the governing elite. In some instances, those two are intermingled, meaning you've got the wealthiest people in the highest positions of power. In other instances, you've got moderately wealthy people in high positions of power. Some cases you've got, more middle class people in positions of power, and others you got working class in positions of power. But generally speaking, especially in the United States, we tend to have shifted away from having sort of more normal people in positions of power, and we've very much gone more for the elite in high positions of power. And so and to the extent we don't have the wealthiest people in positions of power, they're often controlled, or the wealthy contribute to their political campaigns and expect some returns on investments. But generally, yeah, and now, to some extent, when we did have very wealthy presidents in the beginning of the country, they did serve a good purpose, because it wasn't because back in the day, they were supposed to pay for the expenses of the executive office instead of the people of this country footing the bill for them living in their fancy estate. No, they had to pay for everything. It was very much more, it was, I would argue, sort of like a much more of socialistic values that, hey, when you're the executive and you happen to have a lot of money, you're going to pay for all your functions when you're the executive. So you becoming president, so in my experience, if that was what the president had to do, then yeah, we should have Bloomberg. I would be much more open to having Bloomberg being president, or Donald Trump. But with the taxpayer now footing the bill for everything, I think it's the incentive to having a wealthy person being in president is pretty much all gone at this point. Instead, we need to be divorcing political and economically powerful people and institutions from each other. Not to say that governments cannot do beneficial things for the powerful. It's just we need to make sure that those are things that are actually needed, and not say, hey, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, kind of deal, which tends to happen on now through the instance of continuous campaign contributions that stop the second you don't vote the way you're supposed to on at least specific legislation, depending on the industry you're voting on. But yeah, that's the general way in which our government tends to get mixed up into the capitalistic framework. And so the government should be serving the interests of the people. And so we need to have checks and balances that adequately restricts the freedom of, say, businesses to not be able to screw over the common people, to screw over their workers, to screw over consumers, etc. So it restricts their freedom in the sense of not being able to do harmful things to the average citizen, which tends to hurt the average person's freedom and liberty. So again, now many libertarians would disagree with this notion, but again, because they tend to prioritize absolute freedom instead of prioritizing the max amount of freedom for as many people as possible, because when you go for absolute freedom, like, you pretty much can do whatever the fuck you want, especially when it comes to business. What tends to happen is that you get a business consolidation into fewer and fewer and fewer hands until eventually you have a huge, giant monopoly, which is essentially becomes a private state, and can eventually form into communism in practice, because in practice, communism starts off with a different rhetoric, because like it did in China, it starts off as power to the people, but eventually what's happened in China is instead of power to the people, it's power to the owner class, which is the Chinese Communist Party, and that's essentially what's going to end up happening with radical right-wing libertarianism. Is it's just going to consolidate into a small fraction of people who ends up becoming a state capitalist society, because hey, except instead of China, it's going to become Amazon or ExxonMobil. It's not going to be the United States of America. It's going to be the Amazonian Empire, or the Kingdom of Exxon, or something like that. But yeah, it's still going to result in state capitalism. I mean, it's just communism. How that tends to arrive at state capitalism is a bit more nefarious than right-wing libertarians are like, yeah, we want to get all the money, so as much money as possible. So we're not lying to you. So in that sense, right-wing libertarians are at least honest, that they say, yeah, we want the max amount of freedom for everyone, meaning no restrictions at all, which, yeah, you might see some short-term benefit, but we'll see the long-term benefit since we got the cha-ching, which means you'll end up being homeless, and we'll get the private police, and then the people we hire will start to become more of an owner class and co-oligarchs, and we'll essentially live in a Chinese authoritarian state, but just because the government, the official government, is practically anarchical, but the unofficial government, which is the leading corporation, is what actually governs the country with their private police, department, and everything, etc., that goes to benefit, the board of directors and the CEO. Because that's essentially where, unmoored capitalism goes. It's just communism on a different sort of angle. But yeah, so social libertarianism is basically designed to combat all of these nefarious evils, and to give the people the max amount of freedom by restricting institutions of power from restricting their freedom. So in essence, it's similar to, say, non-discrimination laws or other things. But yeah, generally it puts a lot more red tape in terms of business and government to, do unscrupulous things. Now, of course, the theory of it is nice. The questions are, how do we implement it in practice? Now I've got some basic ideas. We're not going to go to at least, I think, get pretty darn close, I think, to the most idyllic social libertarian society, and that is to basically improve democracy and make it more direct. Not completely, but a bit more direct, because unfortunately with our indirect democratic, with the amount of indirect our democratic system is it very restricts our ability to problem solve and to actually get things done as a country, because because we're so far removed from actually having, from every person is so far removed from having a direct say in the policies. We have to compromise with our general political allies to compromise and stuff, and to some extent that can work, but in other stances that gets the people that feel, to some extent that can work, but again, that makes the people who generally have been left out of that compromise, their issues weren't met naturally, so then they start to bring the partisan nature of everything out, and that ends up to how you have gridlock. So you can't always just stack compromises upon compromises into and to where even the national debate is built upon internal compromises. No, you need to have the national debate be even, and then we let the good things happen and bad things go where they may, so that we have, a more even distribution of the debate in this country amongst the beliefs of where the citizenry believes, instead of having, generally removed layers, more removed layers, to where some legitimate concerns that are not being addressed by any major party are more able to be expressed. And that, and even I would argue we should have some limited form of a national ballot initiative, to where, we can, get to where we circumvent the politicians completely, and we do it ourselves. Now, of course, I am very also in favor of limitations on this, because I am worried about majoritarian rule, which is a majority of individuals persecuting a minority. So we need to make sure that there are regulations on complete direct democracy that we do initiate, but generally I think to some limited extent direct democracy can be useful. But yeah, and then also, I think we need to give the individual states more authority and devolve some of it to the national, from the national to the federal through constitutional provision. In that case, because part of our and so what I mean is, let's say 2/3 of the states can overrule federal legislation, and 2/3 of governors can remove the president. The way I say this is because our federal government is built upon the principle, on the foundation, that it is the states, is that the federal government is supposed to be the states working together to create a unified front. Well, if the states are unified, but the federal government is in opposition, well, then the purpose of the federal government, then the federal government has lost its mandate. The federal government is rendered illegitimate. Because, hey, the states have unified. The federal government is in opposition. It is from the states the federal government actually gains legitimacy. Therefore, the states should be able to delegitimize the current federal officials and to strip them of their rights to hold their federal offices. So, they're not necessarily members of Congress cannot be removed, but members of the administration. So the president, the vice president, the vice president, and all cabinet positions that require Senate confirmation, all those people can be removed by two-thirds of governors. However, the Supreme Court is not affected. The Supreme Court must remain independent, must remain intact. So yeah, that's generally that, and so yeah, a lot of the issues of in an ideal social libertarian society would be so where Bernie Sanders says, hey, I think we should go with Medicare for all. Completely agree. Now, as to the specific minutiae, I think generally we need to strive for the Medicare for all system as a goal. Now, of course, Bernie Sanders, I think, has a genuinely good idea for funding it. Now, of course, if we roll it out and turns out runs over budget, we're gonna need to we might need to go back to the drawing board and rethink some things to try and because if it goes too far over budget, we're gonna need to rethink some things, or at least rethink the organization of it to make it run more efficient so we get the best quality care for the best price, as Medicare for all is expected to do. And so we need to make sure we get the best quality price for our bucks, for our taxpayer dollars. And so we need to, make sure we work out all the kinks in that Medicare for all system to be the best system it can possibly be. Of course, it cannot be perfect, but we're going to make it as best we can. Then we're going to need to move on to more social issues. These, I think, largely will be played out in the states. That's why I think social libertarians, we will need to have more greatly funded state. I would think we should have very strong state legislative campaigns, and that's where I think our real strength should be in. Because of course we do definitely need some strength for Congress, because that's gonna. But we also need some great strength in the states, because the states are ultimately our last line of defense. Should Congress, the presidency go, the states are our last line of defense, because of the states that, and we're going to make sure that it is the states that legitimize the federal government. And so if, say, everything goes except the states, then we still got the states, and we can, do some measures that we think are needed to, really reform Congress and the like. So yeah. But of course, the states, they aren't perfect either. And that's why I think we do need to introduce constitutional amendments to better increase the accountability of state government to its citizenry. And I think that's going to be a pretty good endeavor to accomplish, so that we can increase the democracy in our state governments, increase transparency, and through multi-member districts. I think West Virginia does some version of it, so that's going to be good. And then in addition to that, we're also going to do ranked choice voting. I think ranked choice voting is a necessity. We're going to do that. We're going to vastly improve our democratic system, and we're going to actually I'm hopeful that we're going to actually get some real problem-solving solutions in, because on a number of issues, we vastly agree. The problem is translating that into elected office and working that through our institutions through a good way. So once we're able to do that, and we also have made vast improvements on social issues like, transgenderism, then we go and we work for decriminalization of drugs, even to some legalization of some of them, and then we also go to full decriminalization of sex work, and along with what shall we say? The recognition of polygamy, and essentially allow people to do pretty much whatever the hell they want, so long as it does not bother other citizens. We do that, and and also I do strongly believe in actually enforcing the First Amendment, because for too long we have allowed people in Congress to hire a chaplain to administer a religious service before in the beginning of every day of legislative session, on the taxpayer's dime, which I think is utterly ridiculous. No, we are a secular, godless country. We do have people within this country who do believe and have the right to believe in any particular religion, but matters of government are to be purely secular, without God in any conceivable way. Individual members, when they are giving a rousing speech, they may invoke their God should they choose to. But if they want to pray on their own while they're sitting in the pews of a church, or if they're sitting in the chairs of an assembly building, they can pray while they're listening, or they're not doing anything in particular. But there cannot be a religious leader on the payroll for the members of Congress to do their worshiping, to do a religious sermon in the halls of Congress. They want to do that, they can go to church before they go to the Capitol. But they can't do that on the public dime. No sirree, Bob. Not on the public dime. Not on my dime. Not on my dime are they going to do that. They can do it on their own dime, on their own time. But when you're on our time, the public taxpayers' time, you should be doing your job, not attending a church service. Because essentially that's what they turn a bit of the capital into at times, a church service. It's meant to be a place of legislation, not a religion. Because we need to, in fact, build the wall between church and state. And Donald Trump's gonna pay for it. So yeah. That's my say on social libertarianism. Bye for now.